Yo, what up? Holy shit, it's been a long time. We've had some things change. Decided to grow out a little quarantine beard, grow myself a little mohawk and bleach it. But fuck it, it's the same me. Gonna be talking about the Bible, but I did want to let you know that I'm gonna try to expand some things in terms of content on this channel. I don't want to be one of those cliche daily vloggers or motivational or inspirational speakers, but since my interests kind of vary pretty widely from critical theory to cultural theory to film to philosophy, obviously, to politics and economics and the intersection of those two, and then of course to religion and post-religious thinking, I figured I'd try to expand into some of those topics. And one of the ways I'm going to do that is that I'm going to I'm going to slow down the pace of my read through the Bible. It's been a little bit taxing. I mean, things got kind of busy and crazy for me over the last couple months anyway, which is why the videos pretty much stopped. But also I just started to realize that the rate that I was trying to keep up with was just not really doable. It wasn't really doable and it wasn't enjoyable. And I know that's part of the journey, that was part of the experience, is to see like what would happen if I started to read the Bible from my post-evangelical perspective. Would I be able to maintain my inspiration without feeling like I was being forced by God? What would the obstacles be? How would I push through those obstacles, etc.? And I think this is actually kind of a learning experience, a Hegelian synthesis, if you will, coming out the other side, where I'm still going to continue to read, but I'm going to kind of orient myself to the text quite differently, which means that the videos, not only the content of the videos, but also the rate at which I'm going to release the videos is going to shift a little bit, and I'm going to mix it up with some other things, with some cultural theory thought, and with some film analysis, and with some philosophy, and things like that. And I think that actually might create an interesting dynamic where we can see actually how these threads weave together in a weird way. I'm not going to try to do it intentionally. I'm not going to force it and be like, I'm reading from a text in Deuteronomy, and that reminds me of this joke from Chris D'Elia. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be much more of a kind of organic thing that I'm going to just throw things out there, and I'm going to allow us to try to synthesize these ideas on our own time, at our own pace, wherever you are, however I'm able to come across them and kind of develop the ideas, etc. So that's what's going to happen. But I do have some content that I'm going to talk about in this video, so let's run it. So I started reading Deuteronomy. As we left off in our last video, we were finishing Numbers. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Deuteronomy is the fifth text. It's the final text of the Pentateuch, or what is sometimes called Torah, which is law. Deuteronomy is an interesting text. It's kind of the second law in a way. That's kind of what the word Deuteronomy implies. And this doesn't mean that it's like usurping the previous law, but it's an addendum to, it's an addition to what has already been laid out. It's a very important text for both, well actually I should say for all of the monotheistic religions, but I don't know. Something struck me as I was reading the first 3 chapters. And what really struck me was, again, we've been talking about how all of the Torah so far is basically a text of self-legitimation, a text of a community of people seeking to formalize and canonize, we might say, their own identity, their beliefs, their social formation, their place in the world. You get a kind of nascent ethics, or maybe not a nascent ethics, an explicit ethics that you get in this text. Obviously moral codes and things like that. And so I've just been kind of thinking about this because there's a lot of reading, especially from more like militant atheist types, who really want to discredit religion, right? And so they come, I think, with a sense of bad faith to the text to try to be like, you see, the God of the Old Testament is bad, he's mean, he's violent, etc., etc. And that can also turn into a type of anti-Semitism, where you end up getting these subtle and sometimes not so subtle elaborations on how it is that the Israelite religion that then turns into what we could canonize as rabbinic Judaism is built upon a type of supremacy. It's built upon a type of, we might refer to it as an ethno-nationalism, right? I've been thinking a lot about this, not only in terms of the current context and a lot of the burgeoning concerns about white nationalism or authoritarian nationalism, authoritarian neoliberalism that have risen up around the world in places like Hungary, surrounding the Trump movement, the Brexit vote, etc., etc. We all know the story, I think. But I've been thinking a lot about this and how we can look at a text that does seem to have elements where there is not supremacy, because that's a loaded term, but there is a particularism, right? A sort of self-legitimizing particularism that this community sees itself as special, as unique, as called out. And you see this again in the first 3 chapters of Deuteronomy, that God has already set aside this land, right? So the Israelites at the beginning of Deuteronomy have been hanging out around the mountain of Horeb for a while, and God is like, you've been here long enough, it's time to go into the land of the Amorites and claim that land that is yours. I've set this land out ahead of you so that you can go in and claim it. Don't worry, I will protect you like I have always. And he always then refers back to Egypt, right? I will protect you like I did with Egypt. I will be that kind of guiding light. The pillar of fire and things like that is guiding you through the wilderness. I've always been there for you. I will continue to always be there for you. Important theme, obviously, in terms of God's faithfulness, his trustworthiness, and then him kind of reminding them, the stubborn people, as the Bible keeps reminding us, that they don't need to worry, that they just need to trust. They just need to follow God's commands. So then they go in and they wipe out some of the people, and there's some interesting stuff about how certain people are allowed in and certain people are not allowed in. The men of war actually are kind of forced to die off before the Israelites can go in and claim the land at one point, which is a really interesting idea. Sidebar, kind of reminds me of the kind of classical Western idea that you get in films like Shane and in The Searchers, particularly that last shot of Searchers that is just so heartbreaking, where John Wayne's character is not allowed to enter into civilization. He can't enter into the doorway of the home because he's a man of violence. So he comes out from the wilderness, he comes into the world to create the world of civilization, but he can't participate and benefit from that world that he's helped or participated in constructing because he's still a man of violence, a man of the wilderness. So he has to go back out. And that's what you get in particular with that. And you also see this in Shane, and you see this in Logan, the probably best Western that's been made in the last while. And it is a Western, for those of you curious. But there's something interesting about that here as well that you could kind of linger over. But again, I've just been kind of thinking about, like, how is it that we can understand this community of people that are trying to identify themselves, that are trying to ground themselves, legitimize themselves as a unique people set apart from the other peoples in a time period when, you know, there was obviously squabbles and wars over resources and things like that. Does this necessarily lead to these conclusions that a lot of these kind of opponents of all religion oftentimes come to, that the God of the Old Testament is just simply this violent, vindictive, supremacist type of God, and therefore that leads to a type of supremacist mentality? I don't know that we need to go that far. I actually think it does the opposite. Obviously, one could interpret it in that way, and I'm sure that there have been some. I would say that, like, hardcore Zionist movements tend to use this as a type of justification for their expansionary militaristic endeavors. But I think a more sensitive and a more careful exploration of this would focus on the tensions and the anxieties that you get from a community that both uses the means of war and that also is eminently concerned with purity, right? So the fact that the men of war are meant to die off before the Israelites can enter into, that one generation has to pass, is a type of purging. It's a type of act of purification. And then I think when we tie this into the very strict mandates of the Levitical priesthood to maintain purity and holiness, to consecrate yourselves and to separate yourselves from violence, from blood, etc., I think what we get is this really contradictory, and I don't mean that in the bad sense, like it delegitimizes it, but I mean in the kind of productive sense, this real tension of these different formulations, of these different and really difficult ways of trying to understand yourself in the world. You are thrown into a world of violence, in a world of sin, in a world that is fallen, and you almost, in some ways, it's a very determinist way, but you almost have to follow that code. So the idea of the law then is to provide some sense of a taskmaster, some kind of a teacher to navigate you through this messy time. And you will continue to fall into the traps that the world sets because you must. This is the fallen condition of Adam. However, there is always the promise of peace. There is always the striving towards, famously, like philosopher Jacques Derrida talks about like the democracy to come as this idea of like this receding goalpost that is always outside of your grasp, but it is always that guarantee and that promise of a future to come, right? I think you kind of get something here as well, with then ultimately there being a promise of a final harmony, a final salvation, a final redemption, a final fixing of the world and bringing it back to rights. But what you get here through this documentation of this community that is warring, that is trying to claim this land that it believes that is set aside for itself, is you get this difficult struggle in the midst of that chaotic world. And so rather than kind of like jumping to the conclusion and saying, see, God is just a violent God in the Old Testament and then the God in the New Testament is a nice God and he just wants to forgive everybody, I think what we get is actually a very sort of elaborate and contradictory and tense picture of what it's like to be a human and to be a society and a community that is thrown into a world that is fallen, or that is thrown into a world that is difficult, that is replete with strife and things like that. And I think that's a much better way, a much more productive way. One, I think it's truer to the text. I think it's also true to the history of human thought, where there's a lot of cross-resonance that you get with the kind of ancient Israelite text, but also with New Testament text that you also get with ancient Roman texts, like the Metamorphosis, for example, which I recently read, Ovid's Metamorphoses. That you also get with ancient Greek philosophy and Socrates and Plato, the pre-Socratics, that you constantly get this struggling through these different cycles. You get this in Indian philosophy with the various cycles, the yugas, that there are people that are trying to navigate this really sticky, difficult situation in the world. And I think that's really what we need to think about, that's really ultimately what's going on. Not only is it better because it's convenient for me, because I think it like helps me get away from some sort of conclusion that I might not like, but rather I think it actually fits better with the history of how we understand human beings have always tried to understand themselves as they're thrown into situations that are not of their own choosing. That is, they're thrown into the material world. They're thrown into a world that they must inherit and that they must work with. And it's oftentimes a world that has already been constituted by violence, that has already been constituted by bias and by exploitation and oppression. And that's really, I think, how we need to approach not just this text as kind of a text of classical human thought, but we need to approach this text as a real expression of the human condition. What does that mean? Is it the answer? Is it the expression of the human condition? No, I don't think so, but it's definitely a really important one, especially considering how influential the Bible has been over the development in the history of Western society. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. It's a sort of abstract and more fluid way of approaching the text, but yeah, that's Deuteronomy 1 through 3. I don't know what the pace is that I'm going to go through this text, but stick around because I think the channel is going to be much more active and much more interesting rather than just kind of linearly going through things. I might just read a whole book one time and just fucking like ramble about it. I might just do a random video on, I don't know, surfing culture, and who knows, might talk about coronavirus. Who knows what's going to happen, but I'm going to thread these things through, so stick around. I hope you enjoy it. Comment down below, subscribe, share, all that stuff. You know the deal. I love you guys. Later.